Hello, I'm Father Norm Douglas, Executive Director of Heart to Heart Communications. Welcome to this edition of Spirit at Work, a program in which we interview people about their lives, what matters to them, what their core values are, and especially how they connect their spirituality with their daily work. Here with me is the co-founder of Heart to Heart. He's an attorney, and I like to call him Larry the Lawyer, Larry Vuillemin.
Hello. And I know you may think that a lawyer and a priest talking about spirituality in the workplace might be the beginning of a good joke. But years ago, Norm and I got together and explored the question, how do you practically connect faith, values, ethics with the work that you do, with everyday life? We'll be right back with our guest to explore that further.
Welcome to this edition of Spirit at Work. Today, our guest is Brian Ray, Senior Vice President at PNC. It's good to have you here, Brian.
Thank you, Father Norm. It's great to be here.
I know a little of your background and that you grew up in the Akron area, went away, and then came back. What brought you back to Northeast Ohio?
Well, the main reason I came back was family. Both my wife and I grew up in the Akron area, and after being away for a number of years and starting to have children of our own, we thought it was really important to come back and, have our kids raised, right next to the grandparents.
And was there a particular situation that made you think more about family and coming home?
Well, there was. I think that everybody probably remembers exactly where they were on 9/11. And at the time, I was living just outside of Los Angeles. And that morning, I did quite a bit of travel for work. And that morning, I was actually headed to LAX to go on a flight to Durango, Colorado, and obviously the world changed as we knew it on that moment in that day. So obviously I didn't take off for flight that day, and came home, and my wife and I had a real heart-to-heart, and decided that it was time to come back home.
It's good that you did.
Well, it's good to be back.
Yeah.
How did your career evolve? It's interesting, if not unique. Schooling, and what led you into banking?
Well, I came into banking in a very different path, maybe than most. My undergraduate studies were in sociology and psychology, criminology in particular, and I did an internship in the prison system and was looking to go that direction. I knew that I wanted to work with people who had gone through different and hard situations in their life. And as it came about, I went to Atlanta to see my brother during my spring break of my senior year, and heard about a school that was not far from him. It was a boarding school, and that boarding school worked with at-risk youth. And honestly, my first thought when I read the newspaper ad was, this is probably somewhere I should have been. And we all go through different situations in our lives. And when I got back to Ohio, I made a call. They invited me down for an interview, and the school worked with at-risk youth. It was in a boarding school setting, and I went there, and I don't think that I've maybe ever used this phrase before, but at the end of that day, and I spent a whole day there, I felt it truly was my calling. And I called my, at that point, fiance, who was still in Ohio, and I said, I don't know how to tell you this, but I need to move to Georgia. And so that's where it all started. And I was in that school for a number of years, was recruited to go help a brand new school in the Berkshire Mountains of Western Massachusetts, and ended up somewhat going from the therapy end of working with kids to the administrative side. Went to business school, got my MBA in finance from the University of Massachusetts, and then ended up out in California doing work for the corporate headquarters in mergers and acquisitions. And as I mentioned, why I left California, and when I came back to Ohio, that's all I knew, was working in those schools, working with at-risk youth. And out of that came banking. It was a pretty natural progression, actually, with my background in finance. So.
Yeah, and let me ask about that. Do you see in some way banking as a calling?
I think that it absolutely is, and it's interesting. I think the perspective that maybe others have of the industry or of bankers or what it might have you. But in my situation and in my job, specifically. I'm on the commercial and corporate side of the banking group, so I work with large companies. And for me, it's really about maintaining that very close personal relationship with that owner, because that's the only way that I can really serve them. And to me, it's about serving. It was serving with youth. It's serving in this job, and it's something that I very much enjoy. Really getting to know the owners, and I find it very rewarding.
Yeah, good, good.
With all due respect, as lawyers are prone to say quite often, there are some out there that say that folks in the banking industry are too self-serving and don't have as much of a community presence or awareness of what folks are going through out there in the streets, let's say.
Right.
How would you respond to that kind of inquiry?
Well, I think that it's a pretty broad brush, but at the same time, I can understand where some people can have that perspective. I think that the banking industry, like many private industries, has in the past been greedy, quite frankly. And I think that that's what caused a lot of these issues that we had in the last couple of years was greed. That being said, I think that one of the things that I feel very fortunate about with PNC ultimately acquiring National City Bank is that PNC is very focused on the community, as National City was. I think that one of the biggest fears in our local region when it was found out that National City was bought is that those dollars and those hours of the employees like myself and others that were spent in the community working with those less fortunate, that would go away. And in fact, it hasn't. It's actually increased. PNC Bank, as a direct example, has a program called Grow Up Great. And as a corporation, not just in this area, but as a corporation, the real focus that PNC has in terms of serving the community is with early childhood development. And we pour millions and millions and millions of dollars nationally and millions locally into those types of programs, working with those less fortunate. And I think it is our responsibility to be part of that in the community, as it is with any business.
Yeah. Let me ask also, in the community with the economic downturn, a lot of people financially strapped, issues there. How have you seen your banking industry or your own organization respond to some of those issues sensitive to people who are hurting?
Well, it's one of those things in banking. It's sort of that double-edged sword, because due to what has happened over the last few years in the banking industry, the regulations have become very, very tight. So our jobs have become much more difficult because we are being put in a much smaller box in what is an allowable loan. Who can we lend to? So, I think that a lot of the resources that we bring to the community, are not only those, trying to be sensitive in nature and the hours and the volunteers and the dollars that we're putting into the community, but there are also other programs that somewhat government finance, like the SBA, that are allowing us to lend. But the bottom line is we aren't permitted to lend to those who can't demonstrate the ability to pay us back. So that makes it very difficult, because I think some people would see it as, oh, well, you're only lending to the people who don't really need it. But at the same point, to be ethical in business, we are a publicly traded company. We're, our ownership are the hundreds of thousands of people who are in our stock, and they're not going to want us lending money to those who can't pay us back. So it's a very fine line that we have to work through as best we can.
Some folks might define that word ethics as a bunch of rules and regulations that help control a particular industry or organization. How would you define ethics for yourself personally, and maybe as it expands into your work as a banker?
Sure. I think that you are right. I think that some can see it as sort of a set of rules and regulations, but I find, so I'll answer the question in two different parts. One, from my boss, Kevin Thompson, who is the regional president in this area. He teaches it. He requires it of us. I think that there is no better person in this community than Kevin. And I think that, you know, he's very much been a father figure to me. And as I've sort of grown up in the bank, as this was a sort of a second career for me, you know, really taught me how to listen and how to make good decisions and how to, you know, make the ethical decisions for my customers. On the other side of that is really going to be my own faith. You know, as a Christian, I find it my responsibility to, you know, to treat everyone, quite frankly, as Christ would. And as I go through my daily walk, whether it's in the bank or not in the bank, that's what I have to guide my decisions. It doesn't mean that I always make the right decision, but it is my guide. And, you know, it's how I try to operate. And that's my focus on a daily basis.
I know, obviously, your faith means a lot, and also that whole question of you're responsible at the bank, you're doing stuff in the community. What about your family? I mean, how do you balance that out and taking care of yourself, too?
Right. Well, once again, I think that, you know, balance is very hard, especially today. And I think that as sort of leaders in the community, we are continually pulled into new obligations because there's always need. And it does require quite a balance because, you know, I have 3 beautiful children myself, 7, 9, and 11 years old. And I'm very active in their lives. I'm very active in their activities. And it's a real blessing to me. And this goes back to, you know, sort of ethical standards or morals within the bank. One of the first things that the gentleman who interviewed me as I was coming into this position said to me is, you are going to be responsible to balance your time because we are not going to give you a clock to punch in on. And this is the gentleman speaking, I've never missed one of my son's basketball games. Family is important and you need to be there. Sometimes my job requires me at night, but I balance that by maybe I'll go in late, maybe I'll leave early so I can go to those activities as long as the job gets done.
Brian, picking up where you left off somewhat here, and I appreciate your candor. I got the idea that you were suggesting that at one time in your young life you were somewhat at risk yourself. And you've moved now into someone who desires to be a servant leader, grounded in faith and family and values that are important to you. What happened to you to make that transition?
Well, in order not to embarrass my parents any further, I won't go into details, but I'll simply say that I think that all kids, all youth, go through some periods in their life that are very difficult, and there are you know, things that either happen to them, and that wasn't the case. You know, I didn't have some sort of a traumatic experience like many of the kids that I used to work with that led them down the wrong path. For me, it was more of an internal thing. You know, going through the teenage years, feeling accepted. You know, I had some issues. I was, you know, a bit overweight as a kid, and so I had issues around that. And it led me to having a pretty low self-esteem and just making some poor decisions, which I don't like to look back on. But at the same time, I also believe that no matter where we've been in life, positive things, negative things, it all sort of shapes who we become. So I think that I'm a different person because I went through some tough times myself.
Okay. Is there someone or something that happened to you along the way that you point to and saying, well, I finally woke up? Or did it just happen to a
Well, my mom and my wife would both say my wife is what happened. And that's a huge part of it. You know, really, when I met my wife, and we actually go back all the way to middle school, but we didn't start dating until college. But when she came into my life, I knew it was really time for me to make some changes, to look at things a lot more seriously. And I think that was certainly the beginning. As far as my faith journey, when I did go to that first school in Georgia right out of college, there was a man who was probably about my age now, who really took me under his wing. And you know, I wanted to do anything that I could to just be near him and his family. And he introduced me to Promise Keepers. And it was at Promise Keepers in Atlanta where I accepted the Lord.
Thank you.
Yeah, and let me ask you too, just following up on that. You know, there's such an emphasis on ethics today, whether in banking or just in the wider community. How do you see for you, and even if you're talking to other folks, the connection between a strong faith and spirituality and a strong ethic?
Yeah, it can be a tough line. It can be a fine line, because sometimes there are things that we would want to do to help people, if anything, that might not be in the best regard of the bank. So it's really, I think, about just being honest with people. I think that's the most important part. If we can have honesty up front and always, then I don't think that we catch ourselves in a bind. And sometimes the most ethical thing that I can do for somebody is to say no.
Yeah. And your faith, spirituality, do you think in our culture today, in homes and in the wider community, there needs to be a stronger emphasis on that as a foundation for good ethical living?
Well, I do. I think that, faith is very important in my life and my family's life. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing more. My wife and I were actually having this conversation last night about really needing to bring it more into the daily activity in our house. But I think that the ethics are very important, obviously, and I think that faith certainly is a great background and driver of that.
Yeah, good.
You've probably noticed that a lot of people are very cynical and negative, about the way things are going. What hope can you bring to this table insofar as your work in the community and a lot of the businesses that you work with? What would you tell folks out there where to be grounded in order to find hope and some positivity?
Right. I think that especially in this community, there are an enormous amount of people that care. And I guess I don't have the experiences from a lot of other communities other than some that I had lived in, which were much larger. We live in such a special place here in Akron, and being able to have experiences like Leadership Akron and to really know other community leaders, what I can say is there's a lot of people out there in this next generation that are going to follow suit with the current generation. And so I think that absolutely there should be hope, because I see a lot of good things happening in the business world. I see that trickling down into really helping people in society. And I think that we're going the right direction.
Well, hey, thank you for taking us in the right direction here today. It's been a great conversation. And to the folks out there, Larry and I will be back for a brief closing segment.
Welcome back to this segment where Father Norm and I discuss what we heard and just issues that stood out for us in interviewing our guest. Norm, I suppose, as you know, we're so much involved in Heart to Heart about answering that question: how do you practically connect matters of faith, values, and ethics with the work that you do? And I thought that Brian did a good job of trying to answer that question, and did answer that question. One thing that struck me from everything he said, though, was the values and all that he tries to be as a family man, and his work as a vice president is an internal thing, and that his ethics really flow from the inside out. And I've had the pleasure of talking to any number of people over the years, and it reminded me of something Father Ted Hesburgh once said. He's the president emeritus at the University of Notre Dame. He told me one time, Larry, that ethics is fun to intellectualize, but ethics without the heart is missing something. And so I think we need to draw deep. Where are we grounded? What helps shape the decisions that we make? Where are we when the tough decisions have to be made, and where do we reach in order to make those decisions?
Oh, hey, I agree. And one of the things that struck me, and obviously Brian showed it, is a faith that really centers you. They've had courses in college on ethics where people have cheated on the final ethics exam, and people say, what gives here? And a lot of research shows what's important is for people to have the inner virtue, which is the desire to want to be a good person and do the right thing, and the discipline to follow through on that. And I think they see that virtue is often grounded in a living faith, an active spirituality. And I think we saw Brian demonstrating that, and also emphasizing that was important even for his own family. We conclude this segment, and hopefully all of us will think a little bit more about how does our faith impact our virtue, and how does our virtue practically live out in whatever we do. Take care. God bless.